A gray winter sky hangs low over a bomb-scarred German town. The air smells of wet stone, smoke, and cold iron. Roofs are shattered. Streets are quiet in a way that feels unnatural, as if the city itself is holding its breath. Children stand among the rubble. Some wear coats stitched from old uniforms. Others have shoes that do not match. Hunger has thinned their faces. Fear has aged their eyes. For years, the sound of aircraft meant only one thing: sirens, fire, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Then engines appear again. The children freeze. They look up, bracing for the familiar scream of falling bombs. Mothers pull them closer. Old men lower their heads. No one runs anymore. There is nowhere left to hide. But nothing explodes. Instead, small shapes drift downward, twisting gently through the cold air. Paper flutters. Cloth strings stretch and sway. When they land, there is no fire, only the dull thud of something soft against broken pavement. A boy steps forward. He reaches down. His hands close around something wrapped in foil. Chocolate. For a generation raised under bombers, this moment defies everything war has taught them. And in that quiet contradiction between fear and mercy begins a story that could only emerge at the very end of total war. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, Germany was no longer a nation at war in the conventional sense. It was a landscape in collapse. Entire cities lay open to the sky. Rail lines were severed. Factories stood silent or smoldering. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of technological terror across Europe, had been reduced to scattered remnants, grounded by fuel shortages, shattered by attrition, and overwhelmed by Allied air supremacy. For German civilians, the war had come home in the most literal way possible, by air. Since 1942, the Allied strategic bombing campaign had intensified steadily. British night raids and American daylight precision bombing had turned urban centers into targets of systematic destruction. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, Kassel, Dresden. The names alone carried the weight of firestorms and mass civilian casualties. By 1944, bombing was no longer an event. It was a condition of life. Children grew up measuring time not by school terms or seasons, but by raids. They learned the sound of engines before they learned to read. They knew which whistle meant high explosives and which meant incendiaries. They learned to lie flat, to cover their ears, to wait. Food was scarce. The Allied blockade, compounded by destroyed infrastructure and the collapse of agriculture, pushed the civilian population toward hunger. By late 1944, rations for non-essential civilians, especially children and the elderly, had fallen below survival levels. Malnutrition became widespread. Protein deficiencies, vitamin shortages, and chronic undernourishment marked an entire generation. For German children, war meant emptiness. Empty cupboards, empty classrooms, empty streets after dark. Fathers are gone, killed, missing, or fighting on distant fronts. Mothers stood in ration lines for hours, sometimes returning with nothing. The Hitler Youth had once promised purpose and belonging. Now it offered little more than drills and slogans as the world around them crumbled. Above them, the skies belonged to someone else. The United States Army Air Forces had arrived over Germany with overwhelming force. By 1944, formations of B, 17 flying fortresses, and B, 24 liberators filled the daylight sky. Their presence was constant, mechanical, and terrifying. To those on the ground, American aircraft were not symbols of liberation or ideology. They were the source of noise, destruction, and loss. From the cockpit, the view was different, but no less brutal. American aircrews were young. Many were barely out of high school. They flew long, freezing missions at high altitude, facing flak that tore aircraft apart in seconds. Casualty rates in bomber groups were among the highest of any branch. Entire crews vanished between breakfast and dinner. Yet distance shaped perception. At 20,000 feet, cities became grids. Movement became abstract. Targets were coordinates. The bombs fell, and the aircraft turned home. What remained on the ground was rarely seen, and even more rarely discussed. But as the war dragged into its final months, something began to change. Allied forces pushed deep into German territory. Bombers flew lower. Fighters strafed rail yards and roads. Pilots started seeing faces, columns of refugees, burning farmhouses, children standing in fields watching the sky. The enemy was no longer invisible. In April and May of 1945, the Third Reich collapsed. German forces surrendered in stages, then fully. The bombers stopped dropping explosives. But the aircraft did not disappear. They simply returned with a different purpose. And for the first time in years, German children began to look up at the sky without knowing what to expect. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 did not bring immediate relief to the civilian population. Peace, when it arrived, was quiet and uncertain. Cities were still in ruins. Transportation networks were broken. Millions were displaced. Former soldiers, forced laborers, refugees fleeing advancing armies that had already passed. For children, the end of the war did not feel like victory or defeat. It felt like waiting. Hunger intensified rather than eased. With agriculture disrupted and supply lines destroyed, daily caloric intake in many urban areas dropped to starvation levels. In the winter of 1945 to 1946, official rations in some zones fell below 1,000 calories per day. Children scavenged for scraps. They stripped bark from trees, boiled weeds, and searched rubble for anything that could be traded. The occupying Allied forces were now responsible not just for security, but for survival. American troops arrived with clear orders: maintain order, prevent resurgence of Nazism, and stabilize the population. Yet policy alone could not address the human reality unfolding in the streets. Soldiers encountered children sleeping in cellars, begging near checkpoints, or silently watching convoys pass with hollow eyes. The aircraft that once symbolized terror still dominated the skies, but now they were connected to food, medicine, and movement. In the western zones, American airfields became lifelines. Cargo planes delivered supplies for troops, displaced persons, and relief organizations. Pilots flew low and slow, often passing over cities they had once bombed. They saw the aftermath from a perspective they had never had during combat. Some began to notice the children. In towns near airfields, children gathered along fences, waving at aircraft. They recognized the shapes of planes instinctively. These machines had shaped their childhoods. Yet now they approached without sirens, without explosions. The fear remained, but it mixed with curiosity. American airmen were struck by the contrast. They carried candy in their pockets, leftovers from rations meant to boost morale. Chocolate bars, chewing gum, hard sweets, small. Comforts in a foreign land. To the pilots, these items were ordinary. To the children below, they were unimaginable luxuries. The act that followed was not part of any official directive. It began informally. A pilot would drop a wrapped bar near a fence. Another would toss gum from a jeep. A few tied handkerchiefs into makeshift parachutes so the chocolate would not shatter on impact. The children watched in disbelief as food fell from the same sky that had once delivered destruction. This was not yet a program. There were no orders, no press releases, no strategic calculations. It was a human response, unplanned, spontaneous, and deeply personal. Yet word spread quickly. Children told other children. Families gathered. Small crowds formed near flight paths. They learned to recognize certain aircraft by sound and silhouette. Some pilots waved their wings. Others tipped their noses downward as a signal. What had once been a sky of terror began, in small moments, to feel different. Still, these gestures existed within a larger tension. The memory of bombing was fresh. Trust was fragile. The occupying forces were both providers and reminders of defeat. Compassion and power were inseparable. As these moments multiplied, they began to reveal something deeper about how war ends and how its tools can be transformed. To understand that transformation fully, the story must now be viewed from multiple perspectives at once. For German children, the war had been a long lesson in helplessness. They had learned early that adults could not protect them from the sky. Bomb shelters collapsed. Neighborhoods vanished overnight. Survival depended on luck as much as obedience. By 1945, fear had become routine. So when American aircraft flew low and slow without sirens, the children did not cheer. They watched carefully. Years of conditioning told them danger always came first. Hunger overrode hesitation. A bar of chocolate in 1945 Germany was not a treat. It was concentrated energy, fat, sugar, calories that could keep a child standing another day. Many children had never tasted it before. Some did not recognize it at all. They touched it cautiously, smelled it, shared it. In families where bread was measured in thin slices, chocolate was broken into fragments no larger than a coin. The act of sharing mattered as much as the food itself. It restored something war had eroded, trust. The American pilots were not distant figures of authority. Most were in their early 20s. They had crossed oceans, survived flak, and watched friends disappear in fire. Victory had arrived without celebration. Instead, there was exhaustion. Flying over ruined cities forced confrontation with consequences long unseen. From low altitude, destruction was no longer abstract. Streets had names. Buildings had once been homes. Dropping candy was not forgiveness. It was not apology. It was recognition. The pilots knew these children had grown up under bombs. Some realized those bombs had come from their own aircraft. The act of dropping chocolate did not erase that knowledge, but it allowed them to do something different with the same machine. War trains the mind to expect patterns. For German civilians, aircraft meant danger. The body reacted before the brain could reassess. The moment chocolate fell, instead of explosives disrupted that conditioning. Psychologists would later describe such moments as cognitive fractures, points where reality challenges deeply ingrained expectations. For children, this fracture mattered profoundly. It suggested the world could change direction. That power did not always choose destruction, that the sky was not permanently hostile. Yet this confusion did not resolve cleanly. Gratitude mixed with shame, relief mixed with memory. The children did not forget the bombings. They learned to hold both truths at once. And it was within this tension, between fear and mercy, that the story expanded beyond individual encounters, revealing deeper layers still unfolding. Aircraft had been engineered for efficiency, range, and destruction. Their design reflected a singular purpose: to deliver force across distance with precision and overwhelming power. For German civilians, these machines were inseparable from loss. Their sound alone carried meaning. Yet technology is defined not only by design, but by use. When pilots tied handkerchiefs or scraps of cloth into parachutes, they transformed bombers and transports into carriers of relief. The same airflow calculations that once guided bombs now allowed chocolate to drift safely downward. The transformation was small in scale, but profound in symbolism. It demonstrated that technology itself is morally neutral, its impact determined by human choice. In the ruins of Germany, aircraft became instruments of a different message. That power could be restrained. These acts were not official gestures of reconciliation. No crimes were forgiven. No histories rewritten. The pilots did not deny the destruction that had preceded the moment. Instead, compassion existed alongside accountability. This mattered. German children were not asked to forget the war. They were offered proof that mercy could exist even when memory remained intact. For many, this was their first encounter with an enemy who did not behave like an enemy. The moral weight of the gesture lay in its simplicity. There was no speech, no demand, no expectation of gratitude. The candy fell, and the aircraft flew on. Ironically, one of the most powerful symbolic acts of the post-war period began without propaganda intent. There are no photographers waiting on the ground, no leaflets explaining the gesture. Yet stories traveled faster than policy. Children spoke. Parents noticed. Local memory preserved the image of aircraft that dropped sweets instead of fire. In time, these stories reached American command structures and journalists, who recognized their broader significance. What had begun as a personal act now intersected with a larger narrative, one where air power, once feared, could shape perception and trust. As these gestures accumulated, they moved from isolated moments towards something approaching a turning point, when individual compassion intersected with historical momentum, and a quiet act from the sky became something larger than anyone intended. By the summer of 1948, Germany was no longer simply a defeated nation. It was a divided one. Berlin stood at the center of that division, an island of Allied sectors surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. Tensions between former allies hardened into lines on maps, checkpoints in streets, and suspicion in the air. When the Soviet Union cut off land access to West Berlin in June 1948, the city's survival depended entirely on the sky. The Berlin airlift began as a logistical gamble. American and British aircraft would deliver everything a city needed to live: coal, food, medicine, by air alone. It was an unprecedented operation in scale and risk. For the children of Berlin, the aircraft returned once again. The sound was familiar. The fear was instinctive. But this time, the planes did not come in waves of destruction. They came steadily, rhythmically, day and night. Among the pilots was Lieutenant Gale Halvorsen of the United States Air Force. Stationed at Tempelhof Air Base, Halvorsen noticed children gathering near the perimeter fence. They did not beg. They did not rush the guards. They stood quietly, watching planes land and take off. When he spoke to them, he was struck by their politeness and by their hunger. Halvorsen made a promise. On his next approach, he would drop candy for them. With no official permission and limited supplies, he tied chocolate bars and chewing gum into small cloth parachutes made from handkerchiefs. As his aircraft approached the airfield, he rocked the wings, a signal. The bundles fell gently, drifting toward waiting hands. The children ran, laughed, and shouted. For the first time in years, the sky delivered joy. Word spread quickly across Berlin. Children learned to watch for the wing waggle. They named the aircraft. They waited. What had begun years earlier as scattered, informal gestures now crystallized into something unmistakable. In a city defined by political tension and recent devastation, a simple act pierced through ideology. The turning point was no longer just emotional. It became operational. And as the drops continued, command structures took notice. forcing a decision that would determine whether compassion remained an exception or became part of history. At first, the candy drops existed on the margins of military awareness. They were tolerated rather than endorsed, small, unofficial gestures amid an operation focused on tonnage, schedules, and survival. Aircraft were tracked by the minute. Cargo was weighed to the pound. There was little room for deviation, but stories reached beyond the fences. Children wrote letters. Some addressed them simply to the airplane man. Others were passed through military police or local officials. They spoke of chocolate shared among siblings, of parachutes carefully folded and saved, of the sound of wings rocking overhead. Journalists began to notice. So did senior officers. Rather than shutting the practice down, American command made a decision that revealed the shifting nature of post-war power. The drops were formalized. Candy manufacturers in the United States donated supplies. Handkerchiefs became parachutes. What had started with a handful of bars expanded into thousands. The operation became known as Operation Little Vittles. By late 1948, more than 20 American pilots participated. Over the course of the airlift, an estimated 23 tons of candy were dropped for Berlin's children. Each drop was small in material terms, but immense in psychological impact. The children no longer scattered in fear at the sound of engines. They ran toward it. For parents who had lived through years of bombing, this reversal carried deep complexity. Gratitude existed alongside memory. No one forgot the destruction, but the presence of mercy complicated the story the war had written. The aircraft themselves became symbols of continuity and change. The same planes that delivered coal by the ton also delivered hope by the ounce. Precision, once used to destroy, now served endurance. International observers took note. In a city that had become the front line of a new global conflict, these acts softened perception without erasing reality. They did not resolve political division, but they humanized it. When the Berlin blockade ended in May 1949, the airlift slowed. The candy drops ended quietly. There was no ceremony, no final flight. But for the children who had watched the sky with fear, then wonder, something fundamental had shifted. And that shift, measured not in tons or treaties, but in memory, would shape how the aftermath of war was carried forward. When the aircraft traffic over Berlin and Western Germany finally diminished, the silence felt different than it had in previous years. It was no longer the uneasy quiet of waiting for the next raid. It was the stillness that follows endurance. The immediate effects of the candy drops were modest in material terms. A few pieces of chocolate could not solve hunger. A handful of sweets could not rebuild cities or heal trauma. Yet their impact was never about quantity. For children, the drops reintroduced predictability into a world that had been ruled by chaos. The sound of engines no longer meant only danger. It meant possibility. That shift mattered deeply in the psychology of recovery. Relief workers and occupying authorities noticed changes. Children were more willing to approach Allied soldiers. Fear receded into caution, and caution into familiarity. Small interactions, smiles, waves, exchanges of gum or candy, began to replace silence and avoidance. The aircraft that once enforced defeat now helped stabilize peace. In families, the stories were told and retold. Parents listened as children described parachutes floating down, wings rocking and greeting. These moments entered domestic memory, becoming counterweights to years of terror. They did not erase loss, but they balanced it. For American personnel, the experience reshaped perception as well. Many veterans would later recall the candy drops more vividly than combat missions. In interviews and memoirs, pilots described a sense of purpose they had not felt during bombing raids. The same skill that once delivered destruction now sustained life. The aftermath extended beyond emotion. It influenced occupation policy indirectly, reinforcing the importance of visible humanitarian gestures. Trust, once broken, could be slowly rebuilt through consistent, non-coercive action. The skies over Germany no longer belong to fear alone. But memory does not end with immediate relief. As years passed and children grew into adults, the meaning of those moments deepened, transforming from personal recollections into historical testimony that carried weight far beyond the rubble-strewn streets where it began. As the decades passed, the children who once waited beneath Allied aircraft carried those memories into adulthood. For many, the candy drops became a defining moment, not because of the sweetness itself, but because of what it represented at a critical point in their lives. In post-war interviews, German civilians frequently returned to the same contrast. They remembered the bombers first, the fear, the shelters, the sound that froze the blood. Then they remembered the change, the moment the sky delivered something that did not destroy. Historians noted how often these stories appeared in oral histories, especially among those who had been young during the final years of the war. These recollections mattered. They complicated the narrative of occupation. They showed that power could coexist with restraint, that an enemy could act without humiliation. In a Europe divided by ideology, such memories became quiet counterarguments to dehumanization. In the United States, veterans who participated in the candy drops spoke of them as moments of personal reconciliation. The war had asked them to carry out violence at a distance. The aftermath offered a chance, however small, to reconnect with the human reality below. Gail Halvorsen, whose actions became emblematic of the practice, continued to engage with German communities long after his military service ended. He received letters decades later from former children who still remembered the sound of his aircraft. For them, the memory had never faded. From a historical perspective, these acts did not change the outcome of the war. Germany was already defeated. The Cold War would unfold with its own tensions and dangers. Yet the candy drops influenced how power was perceived at the dawn of a new global order. They demonstrated that military strength did not have to rely solely on fear. That legitimacy could be built through consistency, visibility, and compassion. Long after the rubble was cleared and the airfields modernized, the story endured, not as propaganda, but as lived experience passed from one generation to the next. And in that endurance lay the final meaning of the moment. Not the chocolate itself, but the decision to use the sky differently. War is a teacher of extremes. It can shape landscapes, nations, and lives through force and destruction. Yet, in rare moments, it also reveals the quiet capacity for mercy, even amid the machinery of power. The candy drops over Germany were small in scale, yet immense in significance. They were proof that human choices could redirect technology and authority toward care instead of devastation. For the children who caught those chocolate bars, the act was transformative. It did not erase hunger, nor did it undo loss, but it restored something far deeper, the recognition of humanity in an enemy. Trust, once shattered by years of bombing, began to reemerge in fleeting, tangible ways. The sky, once a source of fear, became a medium for hope. For the pilots, the gesture became a personal reckoning with the consequences of war. Machines that once embodied destruction were reimagined as vessels of compassion. And for history, these moments endure as reminders that even in the darkest periods, Human agency can create clarity, meaning, and memory. In the rubble of Germany's cities, amid hunger and uncertainty, a simple parachute carrying chocolate could teach a profound lesson. Power and empathy are not mutually exclusive. The world that watched, and those who lived beneath it, were reminded that acts of kindness, however small, can leave indelible marks on history. And as the aircraft disappeared over the horizon, the children raised their eyes, not in fear, but with hope, a quiet signal that even in war, humanity can find a way to descend gently from the sky.